in the first-class cabin of Flight 728. Daniel Carter knelt in the aisle. His worn brown jacket hung loose as he gathered a phone, a folder, and a scatter of documents from the carpet, where a wealthy woman had thrown his backpack after taking his seat. He did not shout. He collected each item, looked at the woman sitting comfortably in seat 2A, then made one short phone call. Minutes later, the captain and the lead flight attendant came running. She had no idea who she had just humiliated or what he had already done. The gate area at O'Hare had thinned out. By the time the first boarding call went out for Flight 728 to New York, Daniel Carter stood near the window with a coffee he had let go cold, watching the ground crew work under the wing. He was 42, and there was nothing about the way he stood that would make anyone look twice. Brown jacket worn at the cuffs, dark jeans, shoes that had been resoled at least once. He had been flying this route for years and had never once been recognized in an airport. That was in most respects the point. Chicago had been home since the divorce, and the years after it had taught him something about visibility that he had never bothered to unlearn. When a person wore the right watch, doors opened before they asked. When they wore the wrong one, they learned things about people that the right watch would have hidden forever. Daniel had decided a long time ago that the second education was worth more than the first, and he had kept the jacket for the same reason a man keeps a tool he still uses. The meeting in New York that afternoon was the reason for the trip, and he intended to be back in Chicago the same night. His office had scheduled the whole thing 3 weeks earlier and had been managing the logistics ever since, which suited him. He preferred to arrive at things rather than be announced at them. He had booked seat 2A himself, the way he always did, from the same account he had used for over a decade. He boarded early. The jet bridge was cold, and the cabin smelled like industrial cleaner and coffee. He counted the rows out of habit rather than uncertainty. Found 2A on the left side, and set his backpack down in the space beside the seat. It was an old bag canvas, the zipper stiff from years of being overpacked. Inside were his phone charger and a folder of printed documents, because he still preferred paper to anything on a screen. The cabin door was still open. Passengers were filtering in behind him, slow checking overhead bins. Daniel looked at his watch, decided he had time, and stepped back toward the front lavatory before the doors closed. He was gone for perhaps 4 minutes. When he came back, a woman was sitting in seat 2A. She was somewhere in her middle 40s, dressed in the kind of clothes that did not announce a brand so much as assume you already knew it. Her coat was folded across the armrest. She had a tablet open on the tray table, and she was reading it with the total absorption of someone who has already decided the space around her is settled. His backpack was on the floor. Daniel stood in the aisle for a moment and checked his boarding pass more for the sake of certainty than because he doubted himself. 2A. He looked at the small placard above the window. 2A. "Excuse me," he said. "I think you're in my seat." The woman did not stand. She did not even close the tablet. She looked up, and her eyes moved over him once from the jacket to the jeans to the shoes, and something in her face resolved into a conclusion. "I know," she said. Daniel's first instinct was to assume a mistake. Airlines double book. Systems glitch. He had seen it happen. He was still holding his boarding pass, and he turned it so she could see it. 2A, he said. "It's booked under Carter. If there's a duplicate, we can get an attendant to sort it out." She set the tablet down flat, which was as close as she came to giving him her full attention. "There's no duplicate," she said. "I know it's your seat. I want to sit here." Her name, he would learn shortly, was Victoria Blake. Her actual seat was 4C2 rows back, an aisle seat, still inside first class, but away from the window and further from the door. She explained this to him the way a person explains something obvious to a slow listener. She had a day that had been scheduled to the minute since 5 in the morning. She needed to be off the aircraft the moment it reached the gate at LaGuardia, which was why she had not checked a bag and did not intend to wait behind 20 rows of people to get out. She was not going to spend her morning arguing about a chair. Daniel kept his voice level. Then you just need to go back to the seat printed on your ticket. Something shifted in her expression. It was the first time he had contradicted her, and it registered as a kind of surprise, as though the sound had come from a piece of furniture. She looked at his jacket again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Did you actually buy a first-class ticket, or did you get bumped up at the counter?" Daniel said nothing. "Because it happens," she went on. "They upgrade people at the last minute when the cabin doesn't fill, or people cash in points they've been saving for 6 years, which is fine. But it's not the same thing as flying up here, and I think you know that." He looked at her for a moment longer than the comment deserved. "My ticket is the same as your ticket," he said. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and picked the tablet back up. "I have a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars waiting in New York this afternoon," she said. "I don't have time for this. I'm not trying to be rude to you. I'm telling you that this morning my time is worth more than yours, and one of us is going to be reasonable about it." Passengers in the rows around them had begun to notice. A man across the aisle had lowered his newspaper. A woman 2 rows back was watching in the reflection of her window. Nobody said anything. Daniel reached down, picked up his backpack from the floor, and held it. He did not raise his voice. "I'd like an attendant, please," he said. Emily Parker had been working the forward galley and had heard the last part of it. She came up the aisle with the professional half-smile that flight crews learn in their first month, the one that is meant to lower the temperature before anyone has explained anything. "Is everything all right here?" Daniel handed her his phone with the mobile boarding pass on the screen. Emily looked at the seat map on her tablet, and Daniel watched her find the answer in under 3 seconds. "Carter seat 2A, she read. "Yes, sir, that's correct." She turned to Victoria, still polite. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Victoria produced it without hurry. Emily checked it against the same screen. "Blake seat 4C. There it was. No system error. No double booking. 2 valid tickets. 2 different seats. And one woman sitting in a seat that was not hers. Emily did the correct thing next, and she hit it exactly once. "Ms. Blake, I'll need you to return to 4C, please. We're going to be closing the door in a few minutes." What happened next was the part Daniel would think about later. Victoria did not deny anything and did not move. "No," she said. She reached into her bag and set a black card on the tray table, the way another person might set down a driver's license. "I fly this route almost every week. My company spends more with your airline in a year than most of this cabin will spend in a lifetime. I've asked for one thing this morning. I'd like you to solve it." Emily's smile stayed where it was, but the rest of her face changed. Daniel had seen the expression before, in other contexts, in conference rooms and in negotiations. It was the look of someone doing arithmetic they did not want to be doing. She turned back to him. "Sir," she said, and her voice had dropped slightly, "would you be willing to be flexible? 4C is still first class. It's a very comfortable seat. It would help us get the door closed on time." Daniel let the question sit for a second. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" "No, sir." "Did I do something that would cause you to reassign me?" "No, sir, of course not." "Then I'd like the seat I bought." Emily's eyes moved once toward Victoria and once toward the front of the aircraft, where the cabin door still stood open and the clock was running. She said she would speak with someone, and she went forward. Daniel remained standing in the aisle with the backpack in his hand. He understood in that moment that the argument had stopped being about a seat. Emily had read both tickets. She had said out loud in front of witnesses that seat 2A belonged to him. She had told the woman occupying it to move, and the woman had refused. And 30 seconds later, the person being asked to give something up was him. The facts had never been in question. What was in question now was whether being right meant anything at all in this cabin. I was aware of how easily he could end it. There was a number in his phone that would have the door of that aircraft held and a vice president standing in the jet bridge inside of 10 minutes. He could say a single sentence to Emily Parker that would rearrange the entire cabin around him. 10 years earlier, he might have. He did not do it, and the reason was not strategy. It was that he wanted to see what these people would do while they believed he was nobody, because that was the thing about the jacket. He had been in this position before in smaller ways at a car dealership, at a restaurant, at a hospital, admissions desk, and he had learned that the way an institution treats a man it believes to be powerless is the only honest information it will ever give you about itself. The moment he identified himself, that information would disappear and be replaced with something worthless courtesy purchased under duress. There was also a colder calculation underneath it, when he would not have admitted to anyone standing in that cabin. He was flying to New York that afternoon to make a decision about a company and the person running it. He had spent his whole career learning that financial statements tell you what a business has done and almost nothing about what it will do. Character told you the second thing, and character revealed itself most clearly in exactly the circumstance now unfolding in front of him, when a person believes the individual across from them cannot cost them anything. So he stood in the aisle and he said nothing. Victoria took his silence as capitulation. She returned to her tablet, and after a moment she spoke without looking up. "You should sit down," she said. "You're holding up the boarding." The man across the aisle folded his newspaper the rest of the way and set it on his knee. Somewhere behind them, a phone came out of a pocket, though Daniel did not see it happen. Emily came back up the aisle with a second attendant and stopped short of the row. "Sir, our ground service manager is on his way up. He'll help us get this resolved quickly." "Thank you," Daniel said. Victoria exhaled through her nose. "This is absurd," she said, and this time she did look up at Emily rather than at him. "Do you understand what's about to happen? You're going to push back late, and I'm going to have to explain to people why. Over a seat, because a man in a canvas backpack wants to make a point in front of an audience." Emily said something conciliatory that Daniel did not entirely hear. He was watching the number on his own boarding pass on the screen of his phone, and the gate number above it, and the time. The door was still open. The jet bridge was still attached. There was still technically a version of this morning in which someone in a uniform said the simple true thing, and the whole matter ended in 15 seconds. Daniel wanted to see whether anyone would. Behind him, the woman in the window seat, 2 rows back, had shifted so that her phone rested casually against the tray table screen, up-angled toward row 2. She was not obvious about it. She had the expression of a person who had watched enough of these things to know that they are always worse than they look, and that no one ever believes it afterward without proof. The ground service manager appeared in the doorway at the front of the cabin. He was a heavy-set man in a navy blazer with a lanyard and a tablet under his arm, and he was already scanning the rows for the disturbance. Emily went to meet him. Daniel could not hear what she said, but he watched the manager's face while she said it, and he watched it change twice, once when she pointed at row 2 and once when she said a name. The second change was the one that told Daniel how the next 20 minutes were going to go. The manager straightened his blazer, put on a smile, and started up the aisle. He looked at Victoria Blake first, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a customer he recognizes. Then he looked at Daniel Carter, and he looked at him the way a man looks at a problem. "Sir," he said, "I'm Gregory Miles' ground service manager. I understand there's been some confusion." "There hasn't," Daniel said. "Your attendant checked both tickets. She confirmed the seat is mine." She asked the other passenger to return to hers, and the other passenger said no. "There's no confusion. There's just a decision nobody has been willing to make." Gregory's smile held. "Let's see what we can do." Daniel set the backpack down on the carpet beside the seat and stepped back to give the man room to work. Hein had made his choice, and he understood what it cost him. Every minute he stayed anonymous was a minute in which this could get worse rather than better. And he knew that when institutions decide to be unfair, they rarely stop halfway. They escalate because the only thing that justifies a small wrong is a larger one. He was right about that. It got worse 11 minutes later, and it happened in front of every passenger in the first-class cabin of Flight 728. Gregory Miles took the tablet from under his arm and pulled up the manifest for Flight 728. He did it standing in the aisle beside row 2, and he took longer over it than the task required, because there was nothing on that screen he did not already understand. 2 names, 2 seat assignments, Carter in 2A, Blake in 4. "Well," he said, "the record looks clear." Victoria did not wait for him to continue. She closed her tablet, set it on the tray table, and addressed him directly, and her voice had changed from the tone she had used on Emily Parker. It was warmer. It was the voice of someone speaking to a colleague rather than to staff. "Mr. Miles, I know your regional director personally. We sat at the same table at your company's spring event. I'm not going to move this morning because a man wants to prove a principle in front of 20 people. Gregory glanced at the seat placard, then at Daniel. "Sir," he said, "I want to get everybody moving here. 4C is a full first-class seat. Same service, same cabin. Would you consider taking it and letting us push back on time? I'd be happy to look at some compensation for the inconvenience." Daniel had not sat down since the moment he came back from the lavatory. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Gregory's mouth opened and closed once. "No." "Is there a safety issue? An equipment change, anything at all, that would give you cause to reassign me?" "No, sir." "Then why am I the one being asked to move?" Gregory did not answer that. He looked down at the tablet again, as if the manifest might have changed in the last 30 seconds, and the silence stretched long enough that the man across the aisle with the folded newspaper turned his head to look at him. Victoria lost patience first. "He's enjoying this," she said. "Look at him. He's been standing in that aisle for 10 minutes. If he wanted to sit down, he'd be sitting down. He wants an audience." She turned toward Daniel then, and for the first time she spoke to him without any pretense of civility. "Do you know what gives you away? It isn't the jacket. It's that you think a seat is worth this. People who actually belong up here don't behave like this, because to them, it's a chair on a 2-hour flight. To you, it's clearly the most important thing that's happened to you this month." Daniel said nothing. That was the part she could not tolerate. She had spent her career reading rooms, and a man who would not react gave her nothing to work with. She had insulted his clothes, his ticket, his motives, and his standing. And he had absorbed all of it, the way a wall absorbs a thrown ball. Her hand went down to the backpack on the floor beside the seat. She lifted it by the strap and threw it into the aisle. It was not a gesture that had been planned. It came out of her in one motion, and the bag hit the carpet 3 feet away and slid, and the old canvas zipper, stiff for years, held together mostly by habit, burst open along its length. His phone came out first and skidded under the edge of a seat. The folder of printed documents opened and spilled, and paper fanned across the aisle in a long white arc. A charger, a pen, and a few small personal items scattered and came to rest against the base of the bulkhead. The first-class cabin went completely silent. The man with the newspaper set it down on the empty seat beside him. Emily Parker, standing near this galley, put her hand over her mouth and then took it away again. 2 rows back, the woman by the window, who had been holding her phone against the tray table, did not move it and did not need to. Daniel looked at the papers on the floor. Then he knelt down in the aisle in his worn brown jacket and began to collect them. He did not shout. He did not say anything at all. He reached under the seat and retrieved his phone and checked the screen and put it in his jacket pocket. He gathered the documents 1 page at a time, squaring them against his knee, and set them back inside the folder in order. He found the pen. He found the charger. He worked the broken zipper with his thumb until it caught, and it held, and he stood up. The whole thing took perhaps 90 seconds, and nobody in the cabin spoke for any of it. Gregory Miles had not moved during any of it either. He had not offered to help. He had stood there with the tablet against his chest and watched a passenger kneel on the floor of an aircraft to gather his own belongings. Daniel straightened up and looked at him. "Are you still planning to let her sit there?" Gregory did not answer. That silence was the entire answer, and both of them knew it. Daniel took his phone back out of his jacket pocket. He pulled up a number he had not used in more than a year, and he turned slightly toward the window as it rang. And when it connected, he did not identify himself with a title or explain anything. Daniel Carter, Flight 728, Gate 16. He looked at his watch. That's right, doors still open. He listened for a few seconds, and whatever was being said on the other end, he cut off before it finished. Don't explain it over the phone. Just pull the passenger record and the meeting list for this afternoon. He ended the call and put the phone away. Victoria laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound, genuinely amused, and it was the loudest thing anyone had said in 2 minutes. "Oh, that's good," she said. "Is that your lawyer? Is he on his way? Because I want you to understand something. I've watched men do that exact performance in conference rooms for 20 years. The call that nobody can hear. The name nobody recognizes. It's the last move people make when they've run out of actual leverage." She picked up her tablet again. "You should have taken 4C. Daniel did not respond to any of it. He moved back a step to let a late passenger squeeze past toward economy, and he stood there with the repaired backpack in his hand and waited. He waited a little over 5 minutes. The boarding announcements had stopped. The aircraft had reached that particular stillness that comes right before a departure, and Emily Parker was at the front left position with her hand near the door handle, waiting for the signal to arm it. A flight attendant came in through the doorway at something close to a run. She did not stop at the galley. She went straight past Emily, past the first row, and said something to Gregory Miles that nobody else in the cabin could hear. Gregory looked up from his tablet and did not manage to put his professional expression back on in time. Behind her, walking fast, came a woman in a lead flight attendant's uniform. Her name was Laura Bennett, and she had been working this route for 19 years, and she came up the aisle without acknowledging Gregory at all. The cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out into the forward galley in his shirt sleeves, holding a printed sheet in one hand, and he looked down the length of the first-class cabin. Not at the ground service manager, not at the woman in seat 2A, but at the man standing in the aisle in a brown jacket. Then he turned to Laura. "We've lost our slot," he said. "I've told the tower we're holding. This aircraft is not moving until this is settled properly, and I want it settled in the next 10 minutes. Laura Bennett stopped in front of Daniel. "Mr. Carter." Daniel nodded once. The change in the cabin was immediate and physical. It moved through the rows the way a temperature change moves through a room. The man with the newspaper looked at the captain, then at Daniel, then at Victoria. Emily Parker took her hand away from the door handle. Gregory Miles pressed the tablet flat against his chest and stood up straighter than he had stood in the entire preceding 20 minutes. Victoria Blake stopped reading her tablet. Laura did not ask Daniel any further questions. She turned to Emily Parker and asked her to walk through the sequence of events from the beginning, out loud in the aisle, in front of everyone. Emily did it in under a minute. She said she had checked both boarding passes personally. She said the system showed Carter in 2A and Blake in 4C, with no duplicate and no error. She said she had instructed Ms. Blake to return to 4C, and that Ms. Blake had refused. She said that afterward she had asked Mr. Carter whether he would be willing to move instead. Laura's expression did not change. "You asked the passenger who was correct to give up his seat." "Yes," Emily said. Gregory stepped in then, and his voice had a new quality to it, a careful smoothness that was trying very hard to sound procedural. "Ms. Bennett, I want to be clear about the scope of this. What we have is a seating disagreement between two first-class passengers. These things happen. It got a little heated, tempers were up on both sides, and I was in the process of finding a resolution when Daniel interrupted him for the first time all morning. He pointed down at the backpack at his feet, at the zipper that had been forced back onto its track, at the folder inside, with its pages out of their original order. No. The seating disagreement ended the moment your system confirmed the tickets. Everything after that was a choice your people made." The words landed in a cabin where every single person had watched him kneel on the floor. Gregory did not try to finish his sentence. Behind them, the woman in the window seat, 2 rows back, leaned into the aisle and said quietly that she had recorded the last part of it. She held up her phone. She said she would give it to whoever needed it, and she added that she wanted it on the record that the man in the brown jacket had never raised his voice, never threatened anybody, and never touched anyone's property. Victoria understood at that moment that the situation had moved somewhere she could not follow it. She stood up out of seat 2L. It was the first time she had been on her feet since Daniel came back from the lavatory, and standing changed her entire posture toward the room. She smoothed her coat over her arm and addressed Laura Bennett with the fluency of a person who has talked her way out of harder rooms than this one. "There's been a significant misunderstanding here, and I want to take responsibility for part of it. I asked to sit here for a few minutes while I finished reading something before we pushed back. I never intended it as a permanent arrangement. Your crew heard it as a demand, and I understand why, and I'm sorry for the confusion." She turned toward Daniel, and her tone softened by exactly the amount she judged the room required. "I'm sorry about your bag. That was not acceptable, and I know it. It's been a difficult morning." Then, because the instinct was older than her judgment, she added the rest. "I'll also say that I've been a loyal customer of this airline for a very long time, and I'm on my way to New York to close something extremely important. There are people waiting for me. Whatever we decide here, I'd ask everyone to keep that in mind." That was the sentence that made Daniel look at her longer than he had looked at her all morning. Because he knew exactly what she was flying to New York to close. I had known the shape of it for weeks. A company, a term sheet. A request for a capital commitment in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and a founder who had spent 6 months working every available channel to get in front of the fund making the decision. He had read the file on a Sunday evening. He had never met the woman attached to it, and had never seen a photograph of her because his office handled introductions, and he had a long-standing preference for staying out of press. She had not recognized his name either. Emily Parker had read it out loud in front of her Carter seat too, and Victoria Blake had heard it and dismissed it, because the world is full of Carters, and because the only Carter who mattered to her was a man she had imagined wearing an entirely different coat. Movement at the front of the cabin drew every eye at once. A man in a gray suit came up the jet bridge and stepped through the aircraft door. He was in his 50s, silver at the temples, and he was carrying nothing at all, which somehow made him look more important than if he had been carrying a briefcase. The airline kept an executive floor 2 levels above this concourse, and he had walked down from it without a coat. Gregory Miles saw him and came to attention like a man at a review. Victoria saw him too, and something in her chest unlocked. She knew that face. She had seen it at the spring event, on a stage giving remarks. Richard Coleman, Executive Vice President. Someone senior had finally arrived, and senior people in her long experience arrived to make problems disappear for the people who mattered. Richard Coleman walked past Gregory Miles without a glance. He walked past Emily Parker, past Laura Bennett, past seat 2A, and he stopped in front of the man in the brown jacket standing in the aisle with a canvas backpack in his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I apologize. I've just had word from the chairman's office." Victoria's hand went still on her coat. Richard did not lower his voice, and it became clear within a sentence that he had decided not to. Daniel understood what was coming half a second before it came, and he closed his eyes briefly. The way a man does when something he has spent years keeping shut is about to be opened in front of strangers. Richard spoke at a volume that carried the length of the cabin slowly, the way a man does when he wants a record to exist. He said that Daniel Carter was not a frequent flyer. He said that Mr. Carter was the controlling investor in the group that owned this airline, and had been for several years, and that the reason nobody on this aircraft recognized him was that he had never once asked to be recognized. He added one more thing. He said that Mr. Carter was traveling to New York that afternoon to chair a capital allocation meeting, and he named the fund and the time and the address. Victoria Blake did not move. It was her meeting. It was the meeting she had spent 6 months of her life trying to reach. Her company's entire runway ran out somewhere on the far side of it. Daniel looked at her. "You told me this morning that you were too busy to respect a stranger's ticket." He let that stand for a moment. "The meeting you're rushing to is with me." She had nothing to say. Her mouth moved, and she produced no sound at all. And she looked at the seat she had been sitting in, as though it had become something dangerous. But the worst of it had not landed yet. Richard Coleman's phone buzzed against his hand, and he read the screen. And whatever he read there took the last of the softness out of his face. The security office had reviewed the incident. A passenger had deliberately occupied another passenger's assigned seat, had refused a crew member's direct instruction to return to her own, and had thrown another passenger's personal property into the aisle while the aircraft was boarding. Under the carrier's conditions of carriage that gave the airline the right to refuse to transport her on this flight. Laura Bennett looked at the clock above the galley. The captain had given them 10 minutes, and 4 of them were gone. Victoria Blake changed completely in the space of about 4 seconds. The posture went first. Her shoulders came down and forward, and the coat she had been holding across her arm, like a prop. She no longer needed slit until she was clutching it. Her voice, when she found it, had lost the flat authority it had carried since the moment she first looked up from that tablet and told a stranger she knew she was in his seat. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology. A real one. I don't know what happened to me this morning. I've been running on. Almost no sleep for 3 weeks. I had 2 calls on the way to the airport that went badly, and I took it out on you. When there is no excuse for that, I'm asking you to let me start over." Daniel did not argue with the apology. He did not accept it either. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with an apology only gives the person offering it something to push against, and that the fastest way to find out what an apology is made of is to ask one question about it. "If you had known from the beginning that I was the person you needed to meet in New York," he said, "would you have thrown that bag?" She opened her mouth. She was extremely good at rooms, and she had built a career on producing the right sentence under pressure. And for the first time that morning, nothing came. Every person in that cabin watched her not answer. Daniel let the silence run out on its own. "Then the problem isn't that you didn't know how to behave," he said. "You knew exactly how to behave. The problem is that you only behave that way when the person in front of you has something you need." Nobody in the first-class cabin moved. The man across the aisle, who had folded his newspaper 20 minutes earlier, was looking at the floor. Emily Parker was standing at the galley position, with both hands at her sides. Daniel turned away from Victoria. Then, and what he did next, surprised the people in uniform, more than anything that had come before it. He did not fire anyone. Richard Coleman had come up that jet bridge with the chairman's office behind him, and Gregory Miles had been standing at attention for 4 minutes, waiting for the sentence to fall. It did not come. Daniel looked at Gregory, then at Emily, and he asked them a question instead. "The system confirmed the ticket in the first minute. Both of you saw it. I want to know why, after that, either of you thought there was still a decision to make." Emily answered first, and she answered before Gregory did, which mattered later. She said she had known he was right. She said she had known it the moment she read both boarding passes, and that she had said so out loud, and that she had asked him to move anyway, because she did not want a complaint filed against her by a premium customer who mentioned the regional director by name. She said she had told herself it was about an on-time departure. She said standing there in front of the lead flight attendant and an executive vice president that this had not been true. Gregory took longer. "I knew," he finally said. "I looked at the manifest, and I knew inside of 10 seconds, and I looked at him." He gestured toward Daniel without meeting his eyes, "and I made a judgment. She said she knew the regional director, and I believed her. I figured he'd be angry for a few minutes, and then let it go. I figured he didn't have anybody to call. The honesty of it was almost worse than the conduct." "So you didn't choose the passenger who was right," Daniel said. "You chose the passenger you thought was less likely to make you pay for it." Gregory did not dispute it. Laura Bennett looked at the clock, and then at Richard Coleman. Coleman and Richard nodded once. She turned and delivered the decision the way she had delivered safety briefings for 19 years clearly, and without any decoration on it. Victoria Blake was refused transport on Flight 728. She would leave the aircraft immediately with her carry-on items. Rebooking would be handled by the ground staff at the gate, and any question about her future travel on the airline would be handled by someone other than the people standing in this cabin. Victoria looked at Daniel. She did not look at Laura, or at Richard, or at the manager, whose smile she had been so confident about 20 minutes earlier. She looked at the man in the brown jacket with the broken zipper on his backpack, because he was the only person on that aircraft whose decision counted. "If you leave me here," she said, "I miss the meeting in New York." Daniel answered without any edge in his voice at all, which was somehow the worst part. "The meeting will start on time." She tried the only thing left. "Then let me join by video, or put me on the next flight. There's one at 11. I can be there by 2. I'll go straight from the airport." "The meeting has changed," Daniel said. "Changed how?" "We're not evaluating the investment anymore." He picked up the backpack by its strap. "We're evaluating the person who runs the company." She had nothing after that. She gathered her tablet from the tray table of seat 2A and put it in her bag with hands that were not entirely steady. She picked up the coat. She stepped out into the aisle, past the stretch of carpet where her own hands had put his papers 10 minutes earlier, and she walked toward the forward door with a flight attendant behind her and every seat in the cabin watching her go. At the doorway, she stopped and she turned back once, and it looked for a moment as though she had found one more sentence. She had not. She went up the jet bridge, and the door of the aircraft swung shut behind her, and Emily Parker armed it, and the sound it made was ordinary and final. Daniel sat down in seat 2A. He put the backpack in the space beside the seat, where he had set it down before he went to the lavatory, and Emily Parker came by and asked if there was anything he needed, and he said no thank you. And she went forward and did not look back at him. 4 minutes later, the aircraft pushed back from Gate 16. Victoria Blake stood at the terminal window, with her coat over her arm and her bag at her feet, watched it go. There was nothing dramatic about it. The tug rolled the aircraft backward, and the engines came up, and it turned and taxied away toward the runway, with everyone else's mourning still on board. The man she had decided was not fit to sit beside her was sitting in seat 2A. She was the one left on the ground. The meeting in Manhattan began at 2 o'clock that afternoon in a conference room on the 31st floor. 3 people from Victoria's company were already at the table when Daniel came in. A chief financial officer, a head of operations, and a general counsel, who had flown in the night before. There was a chair at the far end that nobody sat in. Daniel put the canvas backpack on the floor beside him and took his seat. The chief financial officer said that Ms. Blake had been unavoidably delayed and asked whether the committee would prefer to reschedule. Daniel said no. He said the committee had reviewed the numbers and the numbers were not the issue. He said the fund had spent 11 weeks on the financials and could have finished that work without ever meeting anyone, and that the only remaining question in a deal of this size was one that financial statements could not answer. Then he told them what had happened at Gate 16 that morning. He told it flatly, in order, without adjectives. And he did not raise his voice once, and by the end of it, the general counsel had stopped writing. The decision took less than 10 minutes. In the weeks that followed, the airline made changes, and Daniel asked for exactly one of them himself. He asked for the seat dispute procedure to be rewritten, and the new language was short enough to fit on a laminated card. When a valid boarding pass establishes a passenger's assignment, that assignment is final. Status spend, loyalty tier, or personal. Relationships, held by any other passenger, are not grounds to alter it. Crew members are not permitted to ask the correct passenger to relocate in order to satisfy an incorrect one. Emily Parker was not fired. She was pulled from the line for retraining and returned to flying 6 weeks later. Daniel had asked one question about her before that decision was made, and it was whether she had told the truth in the aisle when the lead flight attendant asked her to account for what had happened. She had. She had said it out loud in front of an executive vice president and a cabin full of witnesses, and she had not tried to soften any part of it. That was the thing worth keeping. Gregory Miles was suspended pending an internal review. He had known within 10 seconds. He had stood in the aisle with a tablet against his chest, while a passenger knelt on the floor to gather his own belongings. Afterward, he had tried to reclassify the whole thing as a disagreement between 2 customers. And that last part was what the review found hardest to forgive, because it was the only part he had done after he had time to think. The fund declined the investment in Victoria Blake's company. The letter that went out was 2 paragraphs long and gave no reason, because the fund never gave reasons. But Daniel gave his own to the committee before the vote. He said the decision was not about the insult. Being insulted was not a business consideration, and he had no interest in pretending otherwise. He said he had watched a founder discover in real time that she could take something belonging to a man she believed to be powerless, and that the institution around her would help her do it, and that she had not hesitated for a second. He said the fund was about to hand that person hundreds of millions of dollars and authority over employees and counterparties who would have no way to push back on her, and that he had already seen precisely how she used power when she believed nobody could make her pay for it. The video from the woman 2 rows back never went anywhere public. She had offered it to the airline for the investigation, and she had kept it off the internet. And Daniel, who had spent his adult life staying out of press, was grateful for that. In a way he never found a way to tell her. Months later, he was still flying the same route out of Chicago. He still booked his own seats. He still carried the canvas backpack, which he had repaired rather than replaced, and the zipper still stuck in the same place. He still wore the brown jacket. Crews on that route knew who he was now, and a few of them had started addressing him by name at the door, and he had asked them politely not to. Because the thing he wanted changed was never how people treated Daniel Carter once they found out who he was. Anyone can be gracious to a man who owns the airline. That grace costs nothing and proves nothing, and it disappears the instant the ownership does. What he wanted was for the man in the worn jacket with the old bag, the one with no title anybody could look up, no number to call, no way at all, to make anyone pay for what they did to him, to be treated correctly by people who were certain he was nobody at all. Money and status will open a great many doors. They do not confer the right to take what belongs to someone else, and the clearest measure of a person is never how they treat the people who can help them. A system is only fair when its rules protect the person who has no money, no influence, and nobody to call.